right, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about ATP. And in class, I introduced it just shortly, saying that this was sort of the fuel or gas of the cell. And it is, in fact, incredibly important. And the reason why we eat is so that we can somehow get a source of ATP. So with that said, let's spend a little bit of time talking about what ATP actually is. So first of all, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, okay? And it is a molecule. And this molecule is more or less made up of 3 parts, okay? So you have the adenine part over here, and let me use the red color to make it stick. So there's the adenine. And next you have a ribose. And so just to remember, ribose is a type of sugar, so it's a carbohydrate. And adenine is actually part of what you would find as a nucleic acid. So I won't call it a nucleic acid, but it has similar parts to it, okay? Similar. And lastly, you have 3 phosphate groups over here, and I think that comes up. Okay. So one of the really cool things about ATP is that stored in these bonds right here, you have energy. And it's a really unique sort of molecule because it can store this energy. And when this phosphate pops off, it causes some sort of explosion. And I'll draw like this explosion. And this explosion is almost like an energy. And luckily, what can happen is that the cell can harness that explosion. And the analogy I like to use is similar to a car, and it has spark plugs. And those spark plugs will make a spark happen, and that actually drives the pistons of the motor so that you actually have movement. So here's an example of how it actually works. So normally, you have ADP, and it's D because it's called diphosphate, and di usually means 2 phosphates. And you can see that. Do I have that spelled right? Phosphate? Yeah. So you can see that right here that you start off with 2 phosphates. Now, it is the analogy of like a partially charged battery. With the help of photosynthesis, a plant can make this ADP, which is like a partially charged battery, into ATP. And so the only difference between an ADP and ATP is that you have a phosphate that's attached. So by making ATP, you are more or less storing energy in a bond. And this energy can then be used later on for the plant to use to do all sorts of things. So one of the things that it can, and here we were talking about how it's now a storage. And here you can see, so let me go back. This is showing how it's using the energy, and I'll just go back by that. Remember, I was saying ATP is stored energy. And when the cell needs the energy, it actually simply uses a chemical reaction to pop up that phosphate, and you saw that explosion of energy released. So what do we use this for? Well, remember when we talked about passive transport and active transport, and passive transport was osmosis and diffusion, and active transport, remember we were saying, required energy. And this energy that it's requiring is ATP. So it needs that ATP to actually do that. Things like building proteins. We have here an amino acid. Now I'll just do 2 amino acids, we'll call them AA, are bonded together. For another amino acid to come together, it needs ATP to have that happen. Okay? So there are all sorts of building reactions where things like glucose is bonded together to make more glucose, to make eventually a carbohydrate. All these things are require energy to do, and it's ATP that provides that energy. And that is going to be the end of what ATP is.